The morning Delia Hurst was supposed to become Mrs. Gerald Finch was the morning she understood, with the cold clarity of a woman standing barefoot on ice, that she had made the most terrible mistake of her life. The little church on the edge of Caldwell, Kansas sat squat and whitewashed beneath a July sky so blue it hurt to look at, the year being 1882, and the whole town had turned out to watch Thomas Hurst hand his only daughter over to the richest man in Comanche County. Delia stood in the vestibule with her father's thick fingers wrapped around her wrist like a manacle, wearing a dress that had belonged to her mother and had been taken in at the waist by 2 inches because Delia had stopped eating regular meals 3 weeks ago. The dress was ivory with small pearl buttons running from the collar to the small of her back, and it smelled of cedar and old lavender, and Delia thought that her mother, God rest her soul, would have wept to see it used this way. The church was full. Every rancher's wife in the county had come with her Sunday hat pinned at a careful angle. The men stood along the back wall with their hats held in front of them, big weather-burned hands turning the brims round and round in nervous habit. Gerald Finch stood at the front of the aisle in a black frock coat that had been ordered from a tailor in Wichita, and he was 44 years old, and his hair was slicked with pomade, and he was smiling the way a man smiles when he has just purchased something valuable. Delia was 22. She had not agreed to this. That was the truth she turned over in her mind as her father began walking her down the narrow aisle between the pews, her hand tucked beneath his arm now, her white-knuckled grip on the small bouquet of prairie wildflowers that old Mrs. Caldwell had pressed into her hands that morning. She had not agreed. She had protested, quietly at first and then with increasing desperation, until her father had sat her down at the kitchen table 2 weeks ago and explained to her in a voice that was perfectly calm and perfectly final that the Hurst family's debt to Gerald Finch totaled $437, that Gerald Finch held the note on their land, and that if Delia did not marry the man, her father and her 2 younger brothers, aged 16 and 14, would be turned out of the only home they had ever known before harvest, $437. She had turned it over in her mind like a stone. She had looked at her brothers' faces at the supper table, at the way Tommy Jr.'s trousers were too short and how young Pete still had a child's round cheeks, and she had understood that her own unhappiness was not the largest thing in the room, so she had said nothing more. She had let her father make the arrangements. She had stood still while Mrs. Caldwell fitted her mother's dress. She had written no letters and asked for no help because there was no one to write to and no help to ask for, her mother having died of fever when Delia was 15 and her father's family being scattered across Missouri like seeds on wind. The organ began to play. It was slightly out of tune, the way it always was, the high notes going a little sharp and wild. Delia kept her eyes on the floor in front of her feet and told herself to keep walking. She was halfway down the aisle when the church door opened behind her. The sound it made was not dramatic. It was simply the ordinary creak of old hinges, the little gasp of outside air coming in, a brief flooding of summer light that made several people in the back pews turn their heads. Delia did not look back. She kept walking. Her father's arm was tense beneath her hand. But then Reverend Mills, a small neat man with spectacles that he was always pushing up his nose, looked past her toward the door, and his expression shifted from practiced solemnity to surprise, and he stopped speaking mid-sentence, which was so unusual a thing that everyone in the church went still, including Delia, including Thomas Hurst, including Gerald Finch at the front of the room. The footsteps that came down the aisle were unhurried and deliberate, the sound of a man who had ridden hard and was not about to hurry now that he had arrived. Boot heels on wooden planking. The kind of measured, even stride that belongs to men who have learned patience the hard way, out in country where patience is the difference between living and otherwise. Delia turned around. She would remember the moment for the rest of her life, the particular quality of the light coming through the open door behind him, the way dust motes hung in the air around his silhouette. He was tall, lean in the way of men who do not sit still long enough to go soft, with dark hair that had been pushed back from his forehead, and a jaw that carried a few days' worth of unshaved shadow. He wore a plain gray shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and his hat was in his hand, and his eyes, when they found hers, were the exact color of deep river water in the shade, that particular blue-gray that is neither one thing nor the other. She had never seen him before in her life. He stopped walking when he was a few feet behind her and her father, and he looked past her to where Gerald Finch stood at the altar with his expression curdling from surprise into something considerably less pleasant. "I apologize for interrupting," the man said, and his voice was low and steady, a voice that had not been raised in panic, the kind of voice that says what it means without decoration. "But I need to speak before this goes any further." Gerald Finch took one step forward. "Who in God's name are you?" "My name is Daniel Hawkins," the man said, "and I have a prior legal claim that makes this marriage impossible." The silence that followed was the kind that presses down on a room like a physical weight. Delia heard her own heartbeat. She heard the faint creak of the pews as people leaned forward. She heard Gerald Finch pull a long breath in through his nose. Her father's hand closed harder around her arm. "I don't know what you're talking about," Thomas Hurst said, "and I'd suggest you walk back out that door before." "I have papers," Daniel Hawkins said quietly. He reached into the breast pocket of his shirt and produced a folded envelope, and he held it out not toward Thomas Hurst or toward Gerald Finch, but toward Reverend Mills, who stepped down from behind the altar and took it with the expression of a man who very much did not want to be in the middle of whatever this was. Delia watched Reverend Mills open the envelope. She watched his eyes move across the paper inside. She watched the color drain slightly from his face. "Mr. Finch," the Reverend said carefully, "I think perhaps we should step outside." "We will do no such thing," Gerald Finch said. His voice was flat now, stripped of the social warmth he usually wore, and Delia felt the old familiar chill of it settle across her shoulders. She had heard that voice in private in the parlor of her father's house when her father stepped out of the room. She knew what it meant. Whatever this man's claim is, it can be settled in court. Right now we are in the middle of a marriage ceremony. "We are not in the middle of anything yet," Reverend Mills said, and there was a surprising firmness in his voice. "The vows have not been spoken. Nothing has been finalized." He looked at the paper again. "This is a deed of record, Mr. Finch, filed in the Sumner County Recorder's office in June of this year. It shows that the debt held by the Hurst family was purchased and retired by one Daniel Hawkins on the 14th of last month." The words took a moment to land in Delia's mind. When they did, they landed hard. The debt that her father owed Gerald Finch. The debt that had been the chain around her neck for 3 weeks. Someone had paid it. She turned to look at Daniel Hawkins, and he was not looking at anyone else in the room. He was looking at her, and there was something in his expression that she could not immediately name, something careful and honest and a little uncertain, the look of a man who has done something he hopes was right but cannot be entirely sure. "How?" she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. "How did you—" "I can explain everything," he said, "if you'll let me." Gerald Finch moved toward him then, not in any way that suggested actual physical threat, because Finch was not that kind of man in public, but in the way of a man accustomed to filling space and making other men step back. Daniel Hawkins did not step back. "You have no business here," Finch said. "That's where you're wrong," Daniel said, and his voice remained utterly even. "The debt is retired. The land note is cleared. The grounds for this arrangement no longer exist." He looked past Finch to Thomas Hurst. "Mr. Hurst, your land is yours, clear and free. There is no obligation remaining." Thomas Hurst's face went through a complicated series of expressions, moving from anger through confusion through something that looked painfully like relief. He was not a wicked man, Delia knew. He was a frightened one, and those two things are sometimes mistaken for each other. But she had not forgiven him yet, and she was not sure when she would. "This is not over," Gerald Finch said, turning to look at her father, and the threat in his voice was not subtle. "It is over in the eyes of the law," Reverend Mills said, with considerably more courage than Delia had expected from him. He folded the papers and held them out to Daniel. "I cannot in good conscience perform a ceremony that was predicated on a debt that has been legally satisfied, not when no vows have been spoken." He looked at Delia, and his eyes behind the spectacles were kind. "Miss Hurst, you are not obligated to proceed." Delia stood in her mother's dress in the middle of the church in Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1882, and felt the particular vertigo of a world rearranging itself around her. The organ had gone silent. Every person in every pew was holding their breath. Gerald Finch was staring at her with those flat, cold eyes, and her father was staring at the floor, and the man named Daniel Hawkins was standing a few feet away with his hat in his hands and that careful, honest expression on his face. She took her hand off her father's arm. She took one step back, then another. "I am not proceeding," she said, and her voice was perfectly clear. The commotion that followed was considerable. Gerald Finch's voice went up several registers when he started speaking to her father. Several of the ladies in the front pews erupted in the fierce, whispered conversation that small-town churches specialize in. Someone dropped a hymn book. Reverend Mills began speaking in the practiced tones of a man trying to calm a situation without actually doing anything about it. Delia walked toward the back of the church and did not look at any of it. Daniel Hawkins fell into step beside her. He did not touch her. He did not say anything until they were through the door and standing in the full blaze of July sunlight, and then he said, "I have a horse for you if you need to leave quickly." She looked at him. "You brought me a horse." "I wasn't sure what the situation would be," he said. "I thought being able to leave quickly might be useful." She looked down at her dress, at the ivory fabric and the pearl buttons and the improbable, beautiful wrongness of the whole morning. "I can't ride in this." "I know. There's a wagon, too." He looked almost embarrassed. "I brought a wagon." Despite everything, despite the trembling in her hands and the rawness in her chest and the complete uncertainty of what happened next, Delia Hurst laughed. It was not a comfortable laugh. It was startled and a little watery, but it was real, and the man standing beside her in the July sunlight looked relieved to hear it. "You planned this quite thoroughly," she said. "I tried to," he said. "I only found out about the wedding 3 days ago. There were things I didn't have time to plan properly." He paused. "I'm sorry for the way it happened in there. I should have come sooner. I should have found you directly instead of going to the courthouse first, but I needed the papers to be in order before I could." "Who are you?" she asked. Not unkindly, but directly. She needed to know. She was standing in a field outside a church in her mother's wedding dress next to a man she had never seen before who had ridden in from somewhere and paid her family's debt and stopped a wedding, and she needed to understand the shape of that. "My name is Daniel Hawkins," he said. "I'm a rancher. I have land about 40 miles north of here near the Cimarron. I knew your father years back before your family came to Caldwell. We worked together on a cattle drive when we were young men." He stopped. "He wrote me a letter 6 weeks ago." She was quiet for a moment. "My father wrote to you." "He did," Daniel said. He turned his hat in his hands again, the same unconscious gesture she had noticed in the church. "He told me about the debt, about the arrangement with Finch. He didn't ask me to do what I did. I want you to understand that. He told me about it, and I think he was hoping I'd write back with some advice, some solution I might know about. But when I read the letter, I understood what was happening, and he stopped again, and she had the feeling that he was a man who chose his words carefully and was choosing carefully now. "I had the money. It seemed simple." "It is not simple to pay another man's debt." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." "Why?" she asked. He looked at her then, directly and without evasion, and she remembered again the color of his eyes, that deep river blue, and the way he had looked at her when he walked down the aisle as if she were the only solid thing in the room. "I'll answer that honestly when you're ready to hear the honest answer," he said. "But right now you've had a tremendous morning, and I think what you need most is to get out of Caldwell before Finch's mood gets any worse. And after that, whatever you need, wherever you need to go, I will take you there." Behind them, the church door opened and voices came spilling out. Thomas Hurst appeared, followed by two of Finch's men, followed by Reverend Mills still clutching the papers. Delia made a decision the way she made most of her important decisions, quickly and from the gut, with the reasoning coming afterward like a horse following a thrown rider. "Show me the wagon," she said. The wagon was a good one, a sturdy buckboard with a bench seat and a bay mare in the traces that looked well-fed and sensible. Daniel's horse was tied to the back, a large dark roan with kind eyes and a traveler's lean patience about him. There was a canvas bag in the wagon bed and a folded blanket and a canteen of water, and the sight of the canteen, that simple, practical, forward-thinking canteen, decided something else in Delia's mind about the kind of man Daniel Hawkins was. She gathered her skirts and climbed up onto the bench with the practiced ease of a woman who had grown up doing farm work in good clothes, not waiting for help and not asking for it. Daniel untied the roan and swung up onto the bench beside her without any fuss. Her father reached the wagon just as Daniel was taking up the reins. Thomas Hurst was a big man, broad across the shoulders, with a face that the years had weathered into a kind of permanent squint. He was 51 years old and he looked older, and he was looking up at his daughter with an expression that Delia recognized as the closest thing to shame she had ever seen on his face. "Delia," he said. "Papa," she said, and her voice was careful and contained, the way you speak to someone across a distance that is not entirely physical. "Are Tommy and Pete all right?" "They're fine, they're at the house." He glanced at Daniel. "The debt, is it truly cleared?" "It's cleared," Daniel said. "Clean. I have a copy of the receipt at my ranch. You'll have yours in the mail within the week." Thomas Hurst worked his jaw. "I didn't expect, Papa," Delia said, not unkindly but firmly. "I'm going to need some time." He nodded. He looked like a man who understood that he had used up more than his share of things and was in no position to argue about what came next. "Where will you go?" She looked at Daniel Hawkins, this stranger who was not quite a stranger, and he looked back at her with that same careful patience. "North," she said. "For now, north." They drove out of Caldwell in the full white heat of the July morning, the little church receding behind them, the town's dust rising in the dry air and settling again. Nobody stopped them. Gerald Finch did not appear with an argument or a rifle, which Delia had considered a real possibility. The road north was empty except for a hawk riding a thermal in the wide sky above, and the thin line of a creek threading through the yellowed grass to the west. They did not speak for the first several miles, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who are each aware of the other's presence with unusual clarity and are not quite sure what to do with that yet. It was Delia who broke it. "You said you'd answer honestly when I was ready." "I did say that. I think I'm ready." He kept his eyes on the road ahead, his hands easy on the reins. The mare moved at a steady trot, her hooves marking a calm rhythm on the hard-packed earth. "When I read your father's letter," he said, "I had been ranching alone for 4 years. I bought the land after the last cattle drive I ran. Built the house myself mostly, got the herd up to a decent size." He paused. "It's a good life. It's a quiet life. It's maybe too quiet." "That's not an answer," she said. "I know, I'm getting there." He glanced at her sideways, and there was something that might have been the beginning of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "Your father's letter described you. He was asking me for help, and he told me about the girl he was worried about, and he described you the way fathers describe daughters they're proud of even when they're failing them. He told me you were stubborn and kind, and that you'd been running that household since your mother died, and that you wanted to teach school but had never had the chance." He looked back at the road. "And I thought about a woman like that being handed over to a man like Finch, being used as payment for a debt, and something in me got very still and very clear." Delia was quiet. "I'm not a man who does things without thinking about them first," he said, "but I thought about this and I decided very quickly. I went to the Sumner County Courthouse the same week I got the letter. I paid the debt. I thought that was enough. I thought the wedding would simply not happen once the debt was gone." He turned to look at her directly. I didn't know Finch had already pressured your father into setting the date. I didn't know how far along it was. I sent a letter, but it came back, wrong address, and then I rode down here myself, and the first person I talked to in town told me the wedding was this morning. So you rode to the church. I rode to the church. The hawk above them had found something in the grass and was dropping in a long, patient spiral. The day smelled of dust and dry grass and the faint, clean thread of the distant water. I want to ask you something, Delia said. All right. Was there any part of what you did today that had to do with me specifically, or was it? She stopped, searching for the right words. Was it something you would have done for any woman in that situation? The pause before he answered was long enough to be meaningful. I would hope, he said at last, that I would have done something for any woman in that situation. I would hope I'm that kind of man. He paused again. But I'm not going to pretend that the description your father wrote in that letter didn't, that it didn't stay with me. That I didn't think about you specifically. And I'm not going to pretend that when I walked into that church and saw you standing there, I didn't. He stopped. Didn't what? She asked. Feel like I'd done the right thing, he finished quietly. Delia looked out at the Kansas horizon, that enormous flat promise of distance. She had lived her whole life within a day's ride of this road, and she had rarely felt as free as she did on this particular wagon bench in her mother's dress, next to a man she did not know. I want to see your ranch, she said. He looked at her, and this time the smile at the corner of his mouth was not just beginning. It was there, real and warm. It's 40 miles. I know, you said. She folded her hands in her lap. I have nothing else to do today. They made camp that night at a bend in the Cimarron, where a stand of cottonwood trees gave shade that the day no longer needed but the evening made cool and good. Daniel built a fire with the efficient, unself-conscious movements of a man who has done it 10,000 times, and he produced from the canvas bag in the wagon bed a skillet, a slab of salt pork, dried beans that had been soaking in a covered tin since he set out, and coffee that he made in a small battered pot that had clearly seen the entirety of his adult life. Delia had changed out of her mother's dress at the creek's edge, there being a fold of cottonwood sufficient for privacy, and into the plain calico she'd had the presence of mind to pack in the small bag she had brought to Caldwell that morning. The calico was dark blue with a pattern of small white flowers, worn soft from washing, and it fit her properly in a way the ivory dress had not. She felt more like herself in it. She felt like she could breathe. She sat by the fire and told him about growing up on the Hurst farm, about her mother's garden and her father's good years and bad years with the cattle, about teaching herself to read properly out of the single shelf of books her mother had brought from Missouri, about how she had wanted to be a school teacher since she was 12 years old and had never found the path to it. She told him about Gerald Finch the way you tell someone about a threat that has passed, with the particular relief of distance, and she told him how the last 3 weeks had felt, and he listened to all of it without interruption, his eyes on the fire, his coffee cup held in both hands. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "The schoolhouse at Mead City has been without a teacher since March." She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "I was on the school board for 2 years," he said. "I resigned this past spring because the meetings were a 3-hour ride each way and I couldn't justify it. But I know they haven't filled the position." He looked up from the fire. "I could write a letter if you were interested." The fire popped. Somewhere in the cottonwoods a nighthawk called, that strange nasal sound, rising and falling. "You're being very thorough," she said. "I told you, I thought about it carefully. You thought about me having a teaching job before you even met me. I thought about what a woman like you might need," he said, and the way he said it was not presumptuous. It was not the language of ownership or management. It was something else, something that had to do with seeing a person clearly enough to consider their actual life. Whether that ends up being useful to you or not, that's your choice. She looked at him across the fire for a long moment. He looked back without looking away, and she thought again about his eyes in that church, the way they had found hers in all that noise and confusion, the way the room had gone still for just a second. "Tell me about your ranch," she said. He told her about it. He told her about the land, how he had seen it first on a cattle drive 6 years ago, riding through at dusk when the light was going golden across the grass, and how he had turned his horse around and gone back to look at it again, and thought that whatever he did with the rest of his life, he wanted to be looking at this particular light on this particular land. He told her about buying it, about the negotiations with the previous owner, an old cattleman named Briggs who had lost 2 sons to fever and couldn't work the place alone. He told her about building the house, which was frame construction, 2 stories, built with good Kansas limestone for the foundation because the creek flooded every 3rd spring, and a man needed to be practical about things like that. He told her about the cattle, a herd of about 300 longhorns, and about the 2 hands who worked with him year-round, brothers named Cobb and William Rays, good men, dependable. He told her about the garden he had planted and mostly failed at, being better with cattle than with tomatoes. He told her about the cold of the Kansas winters and the way the creek looked in March when the ice was going out, all that roaring, cracking, impossible life. He talked about his land the way people talk about the things they love, with precision and without embellishment, and Delia listened to all of it and felt something loosening in her chest, some tight, frightened thing that had been cinched down for 3 weeks beginning to let go. They slept on opposite sides of the fire, which was proper, and Delia lay on her back looking up at the stars, which in western Kansas in summer are so numerous and so brilliant they make a person feel both very small and very grateful for the scale of things. She thought about the church that morning, about Gerald Finch's cold eyes and her father's guilty ones, and the organ going slightly sharp. She thought about the sound of boot heels on wooden planking. She thought about what it meant to be 22 years old and find out in a single morning that the walls of your life had been made of something less permanent than you had believed. She fell asleep thinking about a creek in March, all that roaring, impossible life. They arrived at the ranch the following afternoon, having started early and made good time in the cooler morning hours before the heat of the day settled in. Delia had the first real look at Daniel Hawkins's land as they came up the last long rise in the road, and what she saw stopped her breath in a way that she understood, even in that first moment, was not just landscape. It was a valley, not dramatic, not the kind of scenery that painters traveled west to capture, but beautiful in the way of things that are honest and well-suited to their purpose. The house sat on a gentle rise above the creek, 2 stories of frame construction with the limestone foundation he had described, with a covered front porch and a kitchen garden to the south, and a good barn, and a working yard with a windmill turning slow in the easy afternoon wind. The cattle were visible in the distance, a scattered dark mass on the yellow grass. The cottonwoods along the creek were green and heavy with summer. "It's good land," Delia said. "It is," he said. There was simple pride in his voice, not the pride of showing off, but the quieter kind that comes from having made something with your hands. Cobb and William Rays were in the working yard when the wagon came in, and they came out to meet it with the friendly wariness of men who have been alone on a working ranch for several days, and are not entirely sure what to make of whatever their employer has brought home with him. They were both in their 30s, Cobb broad and fair with a sunburned neck and a slow grin, William darker and quieter with quick, intelligent eyes. Daniel introduced Delia simply and without excess explanation, which she appreciated. "Miss Hurst will be staying for a time. She'll have the upstairs room." Both men nodded with the easy acceptance of people who have more pressing things to worry about than social explanations, and Cobb took the bay mare to the barn, and William went back to whatever he had been doing with a wheel he had been repairing in the yard, and that was that. The inside of the house was what Delia had expected from a man who was better with cattle than with tomatoes, clean and functional and not quite comfortable, every practical thing in its proper place and every small unnecessary thing absent. There was a good iron stove in the kitchen, and a solid table and 4 chairs and a shelf of books that she went to immediately, unable to help herself, running her finger along the spines. Agricultural reports, a few volumes of history, a worn Bible, 3 novels that surprised her, Dickens and Cooper, and a copy of Jane Austen's Emma that was considerably more worn than the others. "Emma," she said, touching the spine. He appeared in the doorway behind her. "My mother's," he said. "She sent me west with it when I was 18 and told me it would keep me from becoming too much of a brute." Delia turned to look at him. "Did it work?" He considered this seriously. "Somewhat," he said. She laughed again, that startled, honest laugh, and the sound of it filled the kitchen and went out through the open window into the afternoon. And she saw the look on his face when he heard it, that careful, quietly delighted look. And she thought, with a certainty that surprised her with its suddenness, that she wanted to be in a place where that look could happen again. The days that followed were not simple, but they were good. Delia helped with the cooking, which she was better at than Daniel, this not being a high bar but being nonetheless true. She took stock of the kitchen garden and managed to rescue the beans and the squash, though the tomatoes were indeed beyond hope, and she put in a small bed of late herbs that she thought might still come up before first frost. She helped William and Cobb with some of the lighter ranch work, not because anyone expected her to, but because she was not the kind of woman who could sit indoors while work was being done within earshot. And she wrote a letter to the Mead City School Board. It took her 3 drafts over 2 evenings, written at Daniel's kitchen table by lamplight while he sat across from her reading the agricultural report, and pretending not to notice that she was on her 3rd attempt. She wrote clearly and honestly about her qualifications, which were self-taught but genuine, and about her conviction that children in the territory deserved proper schooling. And when she was done, she read it over once and then looked up and found Daniel watching her over the top of the report. "Is it good?" he asked. "It's honest," she said. "That's better," he said. She sealed it and he wrote it to the post the next morning, which involved a round trip of nearly 16 miles, and he did not mention this or seem to consider it anything other than a reasonable errand. On the 4th day, he rode out to check the cattle in the south pasture, and she rode with him, having borrowed a split skirt from the small collection of practical women's clothing that had been left behind by the previous owner's wife, a Mrs. Briggs who had apparently been almost exactly Delia's height. The roan turned out to have a smooth, ground-covering lope that made long distances easy, and she settled into the rhythm of it and felt the enormous Kansas sky opening up above her, and thought that if this was the territory, if this was what was waiting out here past the edges of the life she had known, then she had been living in a very small room for a very long time. They rode side by side through the south pasture, checking the herd, and Daniel pointed out the landmarks, the dark line of trees that marked the creek's southern bend, the old stone fence that the original homesteader had built 50 years ago and that still served as the pasture's eastern boundary, the spot on the far ridge where you could see 3 counties on a clear day if you climbed to the top. "Did you ever want to leave?" she asked. "Any of it? The territory, the ranching?" "Once," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "After my partner went east. We'd ranched together for 2 years, and then he went back to Ohio for a woman, and I understood it. I didn't hold it against him, but the ranch got very quiet after that." He looked out across the cattle. "I thought about going to a city, tried to imagine it, couldn't make it real." "What made it a city feel unreal?" "The closing in," he said. "I need to be able to see a long way." She thought about that. She had grown up on the flat Kansas land and had never thought of the distance as something she needed until this moment, when she realized she did. "I'm the same," she said, and it felt like finding out something about herself for the first time by saying it aloud. He looked at her, and the look went on a moment longer than looks between people who are only being practical with each other tend to do, and then they both looked back at the cattle, and neither of them said anything else about it. But something had been named. 2 weeks into her time at the ranch, her younger brothers appeared. She was in the kitchen garden when she heard the horse on the road, and she looked up to see Tommy Jr., 16 and trying to look older, riding hard on the farm's second horse, a speckled gray that was not really built for hard riding but was willing. He came into the yard and slid off before the horse had fully stopped, and she was already moving toward him by the time his feet hit the ground. "What's wrong?" she asked. He was breathing hard and his face was the particular shade of red that comes from both exertion and distress. "Pa sent me," he said. "Finch came by the farm yesterday. He stopped, looking around the yard at Cobb coming out of the barn and Daniel appearing from the direction of the windmill, and he dropped his voice. He tore up the cleared deed, said the payment wasn't legitimate, said his lawyer would prove it. "He can't do that," Delia said. "The payment was made through the county courthouse." "I know. But he's got Judge Tanner in his pocket. Everyone knows it." Daniel had reached them by now and he had heard the last part. His expression did not change much, but there was a stillness that came over him that Delia was beginning to recognize, that particular quality of a man who is deciding what to do next with complete calm. "Judge Tanner's jurisdiction doesn't cover Sumner County," he said to Tommy Jr. "The deed was filed in Sumner County. Finch's lawyer would need to challenge it there before Judge Harlan, and Harlan is a fair man." He looked at Delia. "He's testing whether we'll back down." "He'll find out we won't," Delia said. Tommy Jr. looked between them with the expression of a young man recalibrating his understanding of a situation. "Are you two?" He stopped, seeming to think better of finishing the sentence. "How is Pete?" Delia asked. "He's fine, he's good. He wants to know when you're coming home." Delia was quiet for a moment. She looked at the ranch, at the house and the garden and the creek beyond, at the enormous sky. She thought about the word home, the particular way it attached to places and people, and how sometimes it attached to things you had not expected. "I'm going to write Pete a letter," she said, "and I need you to eat something before you ride back." She fed her brother in the kitchen, bread and salt pork and the beans she had rescued from the garden. And Daniel sat with him and asked him direct and serious questions about the farm, and what the land needed, and what the cattle looked like this season, treating him as the person most responsible for the answers in a way that made Tommy Jr. sit up straighter and speak with a careful authority he had not yet fully claimed. She watched this from the kitchen counter and felt something in her chest do a complicated thing. After Tommy Jr. rode back south with the letter for Pete tucked inside his shirt, Delia and Daniel sat on the front porch in the evening and she said, "Tell me truly how serious this is." "Finch can make noise," Daniel said. "He can make things uncomfortable and slow. If he goes to Tanner and gets a local ruling, it creates a tangle that takes time and money to clear up. But the deed is legitimate and it was filed correctly and it will stand." He looked out at the evening. The sky was going pink and gold in the west, that impossible western Kansas sunset. "He knows that. He's not trying to win legally. He's trying to make your father panic and you come back to Caldwell." "I'm not going back to Caldwell," she said. "No," he said, as if that were simply a fact, as settled as the limestone foundation under the house. "I know." She turned to look at him in the pink evening light. "You know quite a lot about what I will and won't do," she said, and her voice was not accusing, it was curious and maybe something else. "I'm learning," he said. And the way he said it was simple and entirely serious, and she felt the warmth of it go through her in a way that had nothing to do with the summer heat. She was learning about him too. She was learning that he woke before dawn without any alarm or fuss, and that the first thing he did every morning was stand on the porch with his coffee and look at the sky, not checking the weather, just looking. She was learning that he read slowly and with total concentration, that when he sat down with a book he was gone to the world in a way that she recognized because she did it too. She was learning that he was generous to Cobb and William in ways that went beyond wages, that he remembered the details of their lives and asked after their families, and treated their opinions about the cattle and the land with genuine respect. She was learning that he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking. She was learning that she watched him back. 3 weeks into her stay, A letter came from the Mead City School Board. It was brief and formal, and it offered her the teaching position beginning the 1st of September, which was 6 weeks away. The school was a single room on the east side of Mead City, 8 miles from the ranch. There was a boarding situation available with a family in town, or she could make the ride if she could manage it. She read the letter at the kitchen table with Daniel across from her, and she looked up when she had finished and said, "I got the job." The expression on his face was one she had not seen from him before, genuinely, unguardedly delighted, the kind of expression that does not get put on but simply appears. "Read it to me," he said. She read it to him, and he listened with that complete attention he gave to things, and when she had finished he said, "8 miles is manageable. The road is good most of the year." "You're assuming I'll stay at the ranch," she said. "I'm hoping," he said. The word sat between them, simple and honest and with a weight to it that neither of them pretended not to feel. "I would need," she started and stopped. "Whatever you need," he said, "tell me." "I would need it to be proper," she said. "I'm going to be a school teacher. The community needs to think well of me. I can't," she stopped again, not because she didn't know what she wanted to say, but because saying it required acknowledging something that had been growing between them for 3 weeks without being named. "I know," he said. He looked at her steadily. "I want you to know something. This has not been a calculation on my part. I didn't come to that church expecting to feel what I feel when I look at you. I didn't bring you here expecting anything from you, but I would be lying if I told you I wanted you to go to the boarding situation in Mead City." She was very still. "What do you want?" she asked. He stood up from the table. He walked around to her side and he stopped a few feet away, and she looked up at him from her chair, and he was looking at her the way he had looked at her in the church, that direct, careful, absolutely honest look. "I want to court you properly," he said. "I want to do this the right way. I want to take you to the social in town on Friday and introduce you to every person there and let them see us together. I want to bring you coffee on the porch in the morning and ride out with you in the evenings and read books at the same table and learn every single thing there is to know about you." He paused. "And when I know you well enough to ask you, and when you know me well enough to answer, I want to ask you something." She stood up. She was not a small woman, but he was taller, and she had to tip her head back slightly to meet his eyes, those river-colored eyes that she had been looking at across tables and over horses and through firelight for 3 weeks. "That sounds like a lot of coffee," she said. "It does," he said, and the smile that came onto his face was the best thing she had seen in a very long time. They went to the social in Mead City that Friday, arriving in the wagon as the afternoon was going golden. The social was held in the yard behind the grain store, tables set up with food that every family in the area had contributed, a fiddle player and a man with a guitar making music that did not require an apology. There were 30 or 40 people there, ranchers and their wives, a few traveling merchants, the postmaster and the new Methodist minister and his small wife, children running underfoot. Daniel introduced her to everyone. He did it simply, Miss Delia Hurst, the new teacher, with his hand not touching her back but close enough that the warmth of it was there. People were kind. A few of the women, particularly the older ones who had built lives in this territory with their own hands and understood what that cost, were especially warm, pulling her aside to ask about her teaching qualifications and tell her which children were the ones she should watch and which families needed particular patience. She danced with Daniel twice. The second time, when the fiddle went slow and easy and the sky was going purple-black with the first stars showing, he put his hand on her waist and she put her hand on his shoulder, and they moved together in that unhurried way, and she thought, "This is it. This is the feeling. This is the thing that none of the forced, anxious, obligatory moments of the last 3 months of her life had contained. This feeling of being somewhere you chose to be with someone you chose to be with." He walked her to the wagon after that second dance, and they stood there in the dark with the music still going behind them, and she looked up at him and said very quietly, "I think I was very lucky you decided to come." He looked down at her with that expression that had become familiar and precious to her, that careful, honest, quietly moved expression. "I think I was very lucky your father didn't know my new address," he said. She laughed. He smiled. And it was right, all of it. The weeks of autumn came in with the change of the light. Delia began her teaching in September, riding the 8 miles to Mead City 3 days a week, and sometimes 4, depending on weather, with Daniel riding alongside her when his ranch work allowed and alone when it didn't. The schoolroom had 14 students ranging in age from 6 to 15, and she fell into the work of it with a completeness and a joy that felt like finally being the person you were supposed to be. She was firm and patient and absolutely unwilling to accept less than what a child was capable of, and within the first 2 weeks, she had the older students helping the younger ones and the shy ones speaking up and the difficult ones, all 3 of them, understanding that she was not a person who could be managed. She told Daniel about the school every evening on the porch, and he listened to every word of it with the focused attention that she had learned, was his way of showing that something mattered to him, and he asked questions that were genuinely curious and sometimes surprisingly sharp, and she learned from his questions that he had thought carefully about education and the territory and what the children out here needed. And she thought again about the copy of Emma that was more worn than anything else on his shelf. October brought a letter from her father. It was 3 pages long and awkward in the way of a man who has not said an important thing and knows he must. Thomas Hurst wrote about the farm, about the cattle, about Tommy Jr. taking on more responsibility, about how Pete had read her letter so many times the paper was wearing thin. And then, at the bottom of the 2nd page, in the careful handwriting of a man who found words difficult, he wrote, "I know what I put you through. I know it was wrong. I'm not going to pretend otherwise or ask you to tell me it wasn't. I just want you to know that I think of your mother and what she would say to me, and I don't sleep well for it." She read it twice, and then she sat with it for a long time, and that evening she showed it to Daniel, which was not something she had planned to do but felt right. He read it and handed it back to her. "What do you want to do?" "I want to forgive him," she said. "I'm not sure I'm ready to do it in person." "You can do it by letter first," he said. "Is that cowardly?" "No," he said. "It's honest, and you forgive people for yourself, not for their convenience." She wrote back. It took her a week to write it, and it was 2 pages, and it was not entirely comfortable to write, but it was true. And when it was done, it felt like setting something down that she had been carrying without knowing the exact weight of it until it was gone. Gerald Finch's legal challenge came in November, as Daniel had predicted it would, a letter from a Wichita lawyer disputing the validity of the debt retirement. Daniel had been prepared for it. He had already been in correspondence with a lawyer in Wellington, a sharp and thoroughly unsentimental man named Morrison who had handled similar disputes, and who had, according to Daniel, never lost a case involving a properly recorded Sumner County deed. Morrison filed the appropriate counter-challenges, and the matter went before Judge Harlan in December. Daniel rode to Wellington for the hearing and Delia went with him, which raised no eyebrows among the people who knew them, it being understood in Mead City and the surrounding country by this time that Daniel Hawkins and the new schoolteacher were keeping company in a serious way. The hearing was brief and decisive. Judge Harlan, who was indeed a fair man, reviewed the records and dismissed Finch's challenge with a bluntness that suggested he had encountered Gerald Finch's methods before and was not impressed by them. Afterward, on the street outside the courthouse in the cold December air, Delia took Daniel's arm without thinking about it, just reached over and put her hand in the crook of his elbow as naturally as breathing, and he looked down at her hand there and then up at her face, and something shifted in his expression, something warm and settled and decided. "Delia," he said. "Yes," she said. "I said I'd ask you when I knew you well enough." The street was busy with the midday traffic of a small city, wagons and horses and people on errands. The cold was the dry, clean cold of the Kansas plains, sharp and honest. Her breath made a small cloud in the air. "I think I know you well enough now," he said. "Do you know me well enough?" She looked at him. At this man she had watched for months across kitchen tables and on horseback, and in the lamplight of the evenings, this man who had ridden 40 miles to a church for a woman he had never met, this man who had brought her coffee every morning and listened to every word she said, and taught her the names of every creek and ridge on his land as if giving them to her as a gift. This man whose copy of Emma was worn through from reading and who got up before dawn to look at the sky. "I know you very well," she said. "Then I want to ask if you'll marry me," he said. "Not because it's convenient. Not because it solves a problem. Because I love you and I think you are the finest person I have ever known, and I want to spend the rest of my life on the same porch looking at the same sky with you." She looked at him for a long moment. The city moved around them, indifferent and busy, and the cold air was clean and bright, and the sky above the street was the wide, reckless blue of the Kansas winter. "Yes," she said. "Of course, yes." He pulled her close then, right there on the Wellington Courthouse street with everyone going by, and she let him. And when he kissed her, it was exactly the way she would have wanted it, warm and certain and completely sincere, a kiss that had been building for months and knew its own mind. They were married in February of 1883, which was not winter anymore but was not yet spring, the season being its own kind of hopeful and uncertain thing that felt appropriate for the occasion. The ceremony was in the little Methodist church in Meade City, and it was nothing at all like the church in Caldwell, nothing at all like that July morning with the organ going sharp, and the cold feeling of obligation, and the smell of pomade. This church was full of people who had chosen to be there, people Delia had taught alongside and ridden beside and fed supper and borrowed salt from, and built a life next to in the months since she had arrived in this part of the territory. Cobb and William Rays came in their good shirts with their hair combed flat. Her brothers both came, Tommy Jr. looking so much like his father that it hurt a little to see, and Pete, 14 now, who had grown several inches since summer and who hugged her so hard she thought her ribs might go before he let her go. Her father came too, standing in the back of the church with the posture of a man who understood he was there on grace and not on right, and when she saw him, she felt the last of the tightness in her chest finally, fully release. She walked over to him before the ceremony and took his hand, and he could not speak, but his eyes said everything. She wore a dress she had made herself from blue wool the color of the sky in late afternoon. It had no pearl buttons. It was simple and well-made and entirely her own. Reverend Aldrich, the small, neat Methodist minister with the warm eyes, performed the ceremony, and when Daniel took her hand and looked at her while he spoke his vows, his voice was level and certain, and absolutely without performance, a man saying true things directly because they were true, and she said her own vows back to him in the same spirit, simple and honest and forever. There was a celebration afterward at the ranch, the long porch strung with lanterns that William had made from tin cans and candle ends, and someone produced a fiddle, and someone else produced a jug of something that Daniel pretended not to notice, and the dancing went on until past midnight under the enormous winter stars. Delia danced with her brothers and with Cobb and with old Franklin Brewer, who had the homestead to the north and who had known Daniel since the first days of the ranch. And then she danced with Daniel and did not stop until the lanterns began to gutter and the fiddle player's arm gave out. In the quiet that settled after everyone had gone home or bundled into hay in the barn, she and Daniel stood on the porch together in the cold, wrapped in the same blanket, looking out at the dark land and the creek's glimmer and the enormous spread of the winter sky. "Any regrets?" he asked. "Not a single one," she said. She felt him pull her slightly closer in the blanket, and she settled into the warmth of him, this particular warmth that she had learned the shape of over months and that fit her like something made for the purpose. "I was thinking," he said, "about the south field. I think it could be planted, part of it." "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about it too. Wheat, maybe." "That's what I thought." "We think alike," she said. "We do," he agreed, and she could hear the smile in his voice in the dark. Spring came in with the full violence of the Kansas plains, storms rolling in from the southwest with thunder that shook the house on its foundation and lightning that lit the whole sky like noon at midnight. The creek came up and the south field was mud for 3 weeks, and Delia taught school in boots she had ordered from the catalog, real working boots, and rode through the spring rain on the roan, who was philosophical about weather. She taught her students with everything she had. She taught the older ones to do proper accounts, and the younger ones their letters, and the middle ones the history of the territory that was becoming a state, Kansas having achieved statehood back in 1861, and being still, in 1883, a young enough place that the history was alive in the people who had been there for it. She brought in books from Daniel's shelves, and from the collection she had begun building herself, ordering from the catalog when she could justify the cost, which was most months, and she was happy. She was deeply, completely, without apology happy, the kind of happy that is not a constant euphoria but is rather a steady underlying warmth, the kind you feel most clearly in small moments. The sound of Daniel's boots on the porch steps in the morning, the look of the south field going green in the spring, the weight of a good book in her hands by lamplight, the way the students' faces changed when something became clear to them. In June she told Daniel she was expecting their first child. She had not told him before she was certain, which took longer than she had expected because she had not entirely believed it possible. This new life so thoroughly and completely hers, feeling like it had no more room for surprises. But it did, apparently. It had quite a lot more room. He was quiet when she told him, that particular stillness of a man receiving something too large to respond to immediately, and then he looked at her with an expression that was entirely new and made her want to remember it exactly as it was, that naked, undisguised, wondering look. "Are you well?" he asked first. "I'm very well," she said. He put his hand against her face and said nothing else for a moment, and then he said, "I'm going to need to think of the right thing to say." "You can take your time," she said. "Thank you," he said, still holding her face, still with that wondering look, and she laughed, and he laughed too, and then he pulled her close and held her with a careful strength that said everything the words had not managed yet. The summer was good. She taught until August, when the children needed to help with harvest, and then she stayed home and tended the kitchen garden that was no longer failing, her late herbs from the previous summer having come up so enthusiastically that she had dried enough to last the winter. She worked alongside Cobb and William during the harvest, doing what she could, ignoring their careful attempts to keep her from doing too much, which she tolerated with affectionate impatience. Her father came in July, the first time she had seen him at the ranch. He came with Tommy Jr., both of them arriving with a wagon load of lumber that her father said he had planned to use for a new fence, but that he thought might be better used as a baby's cradle. He and Daniel spent 2 days building it in the working yard, the sound of the saw and the hammer carrying pleasantly through the hot summer air, and in the evenings they sat on the porch and talked in the easy, honest way of men who have both made serious mistakes in their lives and have both been given more grace than they deserved and know it. Delia watched her father and her husband talk and thought about the strange, branching, improbable road that had brought all of them to this porch on this evening. And she thought that the road would have looked, from any earlier point on it, like nothing but a series of wrong turns, but that from here, from this particular point, it looked like exactly the way it had to go. Her son was born in November of 1883, on a cold, clear morning when the frost was on the grass and the creek was running low and quiet. He came into the world with the full-voiced displeasure of a healthy baby and the dark hair of both his parents, and he was 8 pounds and change, and he had his father's eyes, that deep river blue, and his mother's stubbornness, which was evident from the very first hours of his life. They named him James. James Thomas Hawkins, for Daniel's father and Delia's, a name that carried 2 histories and was beginning a third. Daniel held his son with the same careful attention he gave to everything important, both hands, complete focus, that wondering expression she had seen in June now permanent and ungovernable. He looked up at her from the chair beside the bed, and she was tired in the deep, good way of a woman who has done a hard and necessary thing. And she looked back at him and the baby and the world outside the window where the frost was catching the morning light, and thought, simply and completely, this. The years that followed built themselves one upon another the way good years do, not dramatically, not in great lurching events, but steadily and with accumulation, each thing adding to the thing before it. Delia taught school through 6 more years, taking small breaks as her family grew, returning each time with renewed energy. She fought, politely but absolutely relentlessly, with the Mead City School Board for better books and a bigger building, and she won both battles, the second one taking 3 years and involving a letter-writing campaign that eventually reached the desk of the state superintendent of education. The ranch grew too. Daniel expanded the herd, and the south field went into wheat as they had planned on their first married winter. And in a good year, the ranch produced enough to be entirely self-sustaining, and in a great year produced enough to put something away. Cobb married a woman from the town called Martha, who had opinions about the kitchen garden that she and Delia argued about productively for years. William Rays went back to Texas the second winter, and came back the following spring with a wife and a quiet contentment that improved his disposition considerably. Gerald Finch moved away from Caldwell in 1884, the year after the legal challenge failed, relocating to Wichita, where he had other business interests and other arrangements. And Delia heard this news in a letter from her father and felt nothing about it except a mild, clean relief. The kind you feel when you realize that something which once felt enormous has become nothing at all. Her father came to the ranch every summer after that first visit. He was older and the farm work was wearing on him, and Tommy Jr. was doing most of it now with the steady competence of a young man who had grown into himself. And Thomas Hurst came north in the warm months and sat on the porch, and played with his grandchildren with a devotion that he had not, in the business and fear of the earlier years, been able to give his own children. Delia watched this and let herself feel all of it, the complexity and the forgiveness and the grace and the imperfect, continuing love of family. James was 3 when his sister arrived, a girl they named Clara after Daniel's mother, whose copy of Emma now sat on the shelf in the Mead City schoolroom, because Delia thought it belonged where it could do the most good. Clara came in on a spring morning with considerably less drama than her brother, arriving quickly and peacefully, and looking from the first hours as if she found the whole world interesting, which she did, which she went on doing with a thoroughness that would eventually take her to the Kansas State Normal School, and a career in teaching that made her mother proud in a way that went past words. James grew up on the land the way his father had, with a deep and practical knowledge of everything that lived and grew on it. And he had his mother's love of books and his father's patience and his own particular quality, a kind of joyful stubbornness, a refusal to accept that things had to stay the way he found them, that turned out to be useful in the territory and in the following century. Their third child, a boy named Robert, came when James was 6 and Clara was 3, and Robert was from the first day the loudest and most enthusiastic person in the house, with opinions about everything and the volume to express them, and a gift for getting into situations that required extraction that kept the whole family in a state of engaged alarm for much of his childhood. Daniel never stopped standing on the porch before dawn with his coffee, looking at the sky. Delia joined him more mornings than not, wrapped in the wool blanket that had been on the porch since their wedding night, and that was now faded and soft with use. They stood in the early dark and looked at the land and talked about the day coming and the day before, about the children and the cattle and the school and the weather, about the books they were reading and the things they were thinking, about everything and nothing in the easy, accumulated, layered language of people who have spent years learning to hear each other. One morning in the spring of 1890, when James was 6 and Clara was 3, and Robert was still a year away from arriving. Delia stood on the porch in the early light and looked at the land and thought about the church in Caldwell in July of 1882. She thought about the organ going sharp and Gerald Finch's pomaded hair and her father's guilty hands. She thought about the door opening and the sound of boot heels on wood, and the man who had walked down the aisle toward her with that careful, honest expression. She thought about how close it had come to going another way. How if the letter had arrived? How if her father had kept the arrangement quiet? How if Daniel had arrived an hour later or not at all? She felt Daniel come out behind her, the particular warmth of him, the sound of the door, the smell of the coffee he put in her hand. He stood beside her and looked out at the land the way he always did, unhurried and clear. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "About the church," she said. "July," he asked. He meant July of 1882, and she knew he would know that. "Yes." "What about it?" She looked at the land, at the creek going silver in the early light, at the grass moving in the morning wind. She thought about all the things that had happened since that morning, all the accumulated, layered, improbable good of it. "I'm glad you didn't stay in the doorway," she said. He was quiet for a moment in the way she loved, the way that meant he was actually thinking about something instead of just filling the air. Then he said, "I thought about it." She turned to look at him. "You did not." "I did," he said, and there was that smile, that honest, warm smile that she still felt all the way through. "There were a lot of people in that church, and Gerald Finch has never struck me as a man who takes no for an answer, and for about 3 seconds I stood in that doorway and thought, this could go badly. And then I looked at you," he said. He turned to look at her, those river-colored eyes in the early light, everything she had come to know and love in them. "And I stopped thinking about how it could go badly." She held his gaze and thought about being 22 years old in her mother's dress, standing at the halfway point of an aisle she had not chosen, and looking back at a stranger in the doorway and not understanding yet that he was not a stranger at all, that he was the most important person she would ever meet, that the whole shape of her life was about to become something worth having. She reached over and took his free hand, the hand not holding the coffee, and he folded his fingers around hers without looking away from her, and they stood together in the early light on the porch of the house they had built and the life they had made, with the land spread out before them and the sky going pink above the eastern hills, and the sound of James's voice from upstairs beginning the day with his characteristic enthusiasm. "Come on then," she said, squeezing his hand. "The morning won't wait." "No," he agreed and squeezed back. "It won't." They went inside together, into the warmth and noise of the morning, into the accumulated good years of the life they had made from that improbable beginning, from a church door, and a pair of boot heels on wooden planking, and a man who had looked at her as if she were the only solid thing in the room. The door closed behind them on the empty porch where the two cups sat side by side on the railing, the steam rising slow in the cool spring air, drifting out over the land toward the rising sun, and the ranch came fully awake around them, and the day was good, and the years ahead were good, and nothing that had needed to be resolved remained unresolved. It had been a wrong altar and a wrong man, and a door opening at exactly the right moment, and it had led to exactly the right life, and neither of them would ever be anything other than grateful for the strange, necessary, improbable road that had brought them to this porch, this morning, this particular light on this particular land together.